Imagine a master locksmith who is called to open an ancient, heavy wooden door in a village he has never visited. He arrives with a bag full of the most expensive, modern, laser-cut keys used in the cities of the West. He tries every single one. He polishes them, he applies pressure, he uses his most advanced lubricants, but the door does not budge. Why? Because the lock was not forged in a factory. It was carved by an ancestor 300 years ago to respond to a very specific rhythm. A twist that requires knowledge of the wood, the local humidity, and the family's secret history. This locksmith isn't bad at his job. His tools are simply speaking another language. Speaking a language that the door does not really understand. To open the door, the locksmith has to put down his keys. He has to sit with the elders of that village. He has to listen to the stories of how that door was built. And he has to learn a new way of knowing. Assalamu alaikum. I am Talha Al-Ali. And what I just described is the crisis of modern psychotherapy. For years, we have been trying to open the doors of human suffering in colonized and displaced communities using keys that were never meant for their locks. Today, we are diving into Chapter 3, Decolonizing Psychotherapy, Principles and Practices. This is the longest chapter of my book, Decolonised Minds When Radical Becomes Rational. And it's the longest because it is where we stop talking about why we should change and start talking about how we actually do the work. Whether you are a practitioner in a clinic or a student in a refugee camp, these 10 foundations are the new rhythms we need to learn. The first 2 foundations are all about humility. Humility of the unlearning. Let's start with cultural humility. In many training programs, they teach cultural competency, as if you can read a book about the Arab mind or the Irish experience and suddenly have the key. But decolonization calls for a lifelong reckoning with ignorance. The vignette of the second skin in my book really stands out here. I remember a man in his 40s I sat with in Palestine. He had survived imprisonment and torture. He told me clearly, I didn't come here to fix my pain. I've learned how to wear it like a second skin. My supervisor at the time wanted me to stick to CBT protocols for PTSD, but this man didn't want symptoms reduction. He wanted to find a way to tell his teenage son a story that honored his suffering and his resistance. Even though myself and this person were of the same culture and cultural background, but my position didn't allow me to understand his full experience because I didn't go through what he went through. And here we didn't only need cultural humility, which is learning about someone else's culture. We needed intra-cultural humility, to have a humility between 2 people within the same culture, to understand the experience of the person I'm working with. Because assuming the same culture doesn't mean we have the same suffering. And in our positions as therapists, we usually use the expert's clock. Mainstream therapy asks the therapist to wear a heavy expert's clock. It's warm and safe, but it makes it impossible to feel the temperature of the client's room. Cultural humility is the act of taking that clock off and sitting in the cold with the client until you both understand the weather of their life. And this can apply as well for people within the same culture. And that's why intra-cultural humility is important. We often assume that if we share a background, we share a reality. To bring an example from the West to explain intracultural humility, imagine a white middle-class therapist in London working with a white working-class client in a neglected neighborhood. The therapist suggests mindfulness for stress. To the therapist, mindfulness is a tool. To the client, who is facing an eviction notice and damp mold that is making his child's asthma worse, that suggestion is a deafening silence. The therapist is blinded by a middle-class assumption that safety is a given and self-care is a choice. A person who grew up in a materially secured environment will not understand the pressure for the father to choose between heating and dinner. And this brings us to foundations 3 and 4, power and the neutrality trap. We must talk here about power dynamics. Mainstream therapy likes to pretend the room is a blank slate, but for many, the therapy room feels like an extension of the state. The therapist is viewed as an extension of authority, so power is assumed already. For example, when I worked in Libyan detention centers, the people I worked with looked at my notepad not as a therapeutic tool, but as interrogation log. To them, anyone who documents is someone who controls. I needed to reframe things there, and I needed to abandon my notebook or my notepad. I had to name this imbalance. Sometimes I would say, I know, I can walk out of these gates, and you cannot. How should we use this truth? For some people this might sound like politics, but it's really not. It's a clinician precision. When we acknowledge the passport of professionalism, we create the only real ground for trust. When we acknowledge our freedom of movement to people who are unfairly being detained, we acknowledge power imbalance. When we come wearing clean clothes to someone who's barely having cloths to cover their skin, we need to name the power and the difference and the privilege. And this brings us to the myth of neutrality. Therapy has never been neutral. If a child in Gaza has nightmares because of drones, that isn't a disorder. It is a rational response to irrational violence. And when a child is hurt, targeted, or killed, hurting that child is wrongdoing, regardless. So being neutral means we are fine with this wrongdoing. Now, pretending to be neutral is like wearing colorless spectacles in a world on fire. You might think you're seeing clearly, but you are actually just refusing to acknowledge the smoke. And a decolonized practice, we name the political architecture of suffering. The rent hikes, the border regimes, the racism, because if we don't name it, we are complicit in it, complicit with our silence. And when we speak of silence, we need to speak of language. And this moves us to Foundation 5, the theft of language. Foundation 5 is the reclamation of language. Therapy often performs a kind of linguistic violence by reducing the poetry of survival to sterile clinical terms. In Balata refugee camp in Nablus, Palestine, a grandmother once stopped me with a wave of her hand when I wrote nightmares. She said, "You write nightmares. We call it the dreams of return. Even our sleep knows we belong in the homes we were kicked out of." Her words were not a symptom. They were a reclamation of identity. She wanted to hold on to these nightmares that we viewed as disturbing because she wanted them to keep reminding her where she belongs. Another example, an Iraqi journalist showed me his torture scars and said, "Your textbook calls these body memories, but these are receipts. Each one proves who held the knife and who looked away." I now ask my clients, what did your grandmother call this feeling before doctors named it for you? What did your grandparents call it before we named it anxiety? I would ask, if your pain had a name in your mother tongue, what would it be? we start looking for a shared vocabulary that honors their soul, not just a manual. We move now to pluralism. This is the belief that there is no single correct way to heal. With Syrian refugees in Jordan, CBT worksheets often felt like a foreign language, and they are a foreign language to them. But when we used the Dabka dance, a tradition of asabiya, social cohesions, we saw trauma processed through the body in ways talk therapy cannot reach. The collective rhythm was the medicine. The solidarity was a medicine. Now to move to resistance as healing. This is perhaps one of my favorite foundations. We must see resistance as a psychological lifeline, not a defense mechanism. And resistance has different layers. First, resisting outside the therapy room, resisting the oppressive regimes, and inside the therapy room, when clients resisting to engage with a therapist, when they are setting boundaries, and when they are holding onto their identity. A young woman in Ramallah I worked with, who was imprisoned for protesting, did not want to talk about trauma. She wanted me to recognize her pride. She said, "They took everything else, but they could not take my pride." Now imagine the plant in the pavement. Mainstream therapy often tries to trim the plant so it fits the pavement. Decolonized psychotherapy asks, why is the pavement so thick? And how can we support the strength of the root that is breaking through it? We validate silence as a boundary and anger as moral clarity. And moving on, we need to acknowledge that decolonization centers interconnectedness over individualism. A Palestinian refugee in Ireland told me he felt like an uprooted tree. Instead of mindfulness, we focused on replanting. We use land as a co-therapist. He planted a pot of mint in his kitchen because it smelled like his morning tea in Palestine. And in soil therapy, I worked with another person in Dublin who kept a small pouch of soil from her family-raised olive grove. Holding that soil was her grounding exercise. It was a physical bridge to her heritage that no Western safe place visualization could ever match. Now we'll move to the last foundation, accountability. We need to perform privilege audit. We must hold ourselves accountable. For example, before I see a client in a detention center, I would document my own mobility, my linguistic power, and my institutional authority. I even document how I have to negotiate with guards to get access to these clients. I must be transparent with the client. My training uses Western frameworks that may not fit you. Please interrupt me when that happens. As we went quickly through the 10 foundations of decolonizing psychotherapy as I've envisioned them, and as we close this deep dive into chapter 3, remember that decolonization is not a destination or a checkbox. It is a spiral of returning. We are not fixing people. We are co-weaving healing networks that respect cultural sovereignty. We are moving from the expert's chair to the circle of firelight, where the client is the narrator of their own epic of resistance. To my colleagues and listeners, stay with the discomfort. Stay with the work. The radical only feels radical until you realize it is the only rational way to honor the fullness of our shared humanity. In our next episode, we move into chapter 4, exploring how social justice is not an extra for therapists, but a clinical imperative. Please, stay with the work.